Good morning. We'll go ahead and call the committee to order. Thank you all for being here this morning. We have a full committee hearing on the Department of the Air Force fiscal year 2023 budget request, part of our ongoing posture hearings as we take a look at the President's budget and prepare for how we want to handle it for the process for the rest of this year. We are joined by the Honorable Frank Kendall, who is the Secretary for the United States Air Force, General Charles Brown, Chief of Staff for the United States Air Force, and General John Raymond, who is the Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force. Thank you, gentlemen, all for being here. And this is a very interesting time as we try to figure out how to meet our national security needs at the moment, and at the same time prepare for a rapidly changing future. And I think that's the main theme of this hearing. Both within the Space Force and within the Air Force, you have a fairly complicated set of plans to figure out what platforms you're going to need to meet the missions that you're being asked to do. On the Air Force side, we are juggling a variety of different systems to try to figure out how to get to the appropriate number of air wings, what to do with the F-35 as we continue to await the delivery of the Block 4, the capability that we really want, while at the same time dealing with legacy aircraft systems like the A-10 and the F-22. So, General Brown and Secretary Kendall, we're most interested to hear sort of what's the vision of how that plays out. I know those plans have changed quite a bit from year to year as the situation has evolved, costs has evolved, and as we've learned more about what we're going to need going forward. It'd be good to get sort of a quick summary of where you're at now today and your confidence level, both in what the plan is and our ability to implement it in terms of funding and also in terms of building those capabilities. And I think the thing that has changed the most, which is a continuing theme for this committee, is how survivability and weapon systems have really changed. And we're certainly seeing that in the fight in Ukraine. Missiles and drones and information systems have changed everything. Platforms are not as survivable as they used to be, and we need to figure out how they can operate within hostile environments and how we can build better platforms that can operate within those hostile environments. If a swarm of relatively low-cost drones can deliver a better punch and is more survivable in an environment than an incredibly expensive airplane, how does that change our plans going forward in terms of what we need? Because I think as we look at the fight in Ukraine again right now, the number one biggest thing that we all wish we had more of is missiles, and number two is drones. So how does that factor into our plans? And then, of course, long-range fires that are a huge part of survivability as well. Being able to hit the enemy from a greater distance than they can hit you matters enormously. How does that fit into those plans going forward? There are some similar challenges within the Space Force. I mean, certainly the information systems space is absolutely key to that. The ability to gather the information we need and distribute it to the people who need it when they need it, and to make sure we can protect it. That is increasingly important on the battlefield these days, and also more and more challenging to make sure that those systems are survivable as we need to upgrade that. So very curious to see how all of the systems are being upgraded to make sure that they meet those requirements. Then, of course, the other huge thing in space is we're planning on launching a lot of satellites in the next 20 years. Part of how we want to develop that survivable infrastructure, that survivable information system infrastructure, is to have more redundancy. Instead of relying on a few exquisite platforms, have more spread out that are more survivable and more redundant. But to get there, that's a lot of work in terms of building the satellites, launching them, maintaining them. Curious to see how that fits within the budget. And we do have to figure out how to fit within the budget. I know there will be a lot of discussion today about whether or not you have enough money. Does anybody, other than Elon Musk, that is, ever really have enough money? I'm interested in that, certainly. Inflation, supply chain, these issues are complicating everything that I just said and everything that you're trying to do. We are curious to know how you're looking at handling those issues. But also, whatever you got to spend it well. And it's just been my experience throughout life that you can give somebody 10 times as much money, but if the person with 1/10 the money spends it better, they're going to win. So how do you make sure that you're spending the money in an efficient and effective way to deliver what you're trying to get? So curious about all of those issues. With that, I will yield to Mr. Rogers for his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for their service to our country and for their preparation and attendance today. I do remain extremely concerned about President Biden's budget proposal. The budget request does not keep pace with the threats we're facing from China or Russia, and it does not keep pace with the historic levels of inflation we're currently experiencing. Inflation is eating into the buying power of the department and impacting the livelihoods of our service members and their families, and it's not going down anytime soon. We're going to be dealing with this problem well into FY23 and beyond, but the budget request doesn't account for it. General Milley testified to that fact last month. This means nearly every dollar of increase this budget has is eaten up by inflation. Very little, if anything, will be left over to modernize or grow capacity. That forces our service chiefs to make unnecessary choices about the requirements to fund, which requirements to fund and which to defer. The $5.2 billion unfunded priorities submitted by General Brown and General Raymond are a testament to that fact. Priorities such as F-35s, hypersonic weapons, missile warning and tracking, and the critical weapons and facility sustainment all went underfunded in this budget. These are exactly the priorities we should be funding. The budget continues the Air Force's strategy to divest capabilities that aren't survivable in a fight against China and use the savings to invest in advanced technologies capable of prevailing in that conflict. While I support that approach, we should ask tough questions about how much risk we're absorbing and for how long. Many of the divestments in this year's budget would undermine the service's ability to continue to meet critical requirements until the next decade. That's because replacements are still early in the development process while delivery timelines continue to move to the right. To make matters worse, the budget cuts the buy for many capabilities we need to bridge the gap. It means the administration is gambling that China, Russia, or some other adversary won't force us into conflict before 2030. Given the atrocities we're witnessing in Ukraine, that's a dangerous bet. Divest to invest is important, but it can't leave our combatant commanders trying to fill near-term requirements with empty toolbox. Finally, I'm glad to see the increased investments proposed by the Space Force. We must continue to push forward with distributed architecture in space in a smart way that provides capabilities to the warfighters now while accelerating future systems. I also want to highlight that General Raymond's request to make it easier to move Guardians between active and reserve status is a great move. This is exactly the type of innovative approach to warfighting that we envisioned when we created the Space Force. I know there are several issues to work through on this proposal, but I look forward to seeing it happen. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Secretary Kendall, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee. I'm honored to have General Brown and General Raymond join me in representing the nearly 700,000 airmen and guardians that defend our nation. We're all thankful for your consistent support over the years. Speaking in 1940, General Douglas MacArthur said the following: "The history of failure in war can almost be summed up in two words: too late. Too late in comprehending the deadly purpose of a potential enemy, too late in realizing the mortal danger, too late in preparedness, too late in uniting all possible forces for resistance, and too late in standing with one's friends." I believe MacArthur made this comment after France fell to Nazi aggression, but before the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into a war in Asia, a time that in some ways may be analogous to today. What my colleagues and I are trying to do, and what we need your help with, is to ensure that American air and space forces are never too late in meeting our pacing challenge, which is China. We're also concerned about the now obvious and acute threat of Russian aggression. Many of you have heard the China threat briefing that we presented. It lays out China's efforts to develop and field forces that could defeat our ability to project power in the Western Pacific. Today, we'll say more about how the Department of the Air Force is responding to that threat through our fiscal year 23 budget and through future budgets. Our budget submission provides a balance between the capabilities we need today and investments in transformation required to address emerging threats. With the requested budget, the Air and Space Forces will be able to support our combatant commanders in the continuing campaigns that demonstrate our resolve and support and encourage our allies and partners around the world. Simultaneously, our fiscal year 23 budget represents a significant early step in the transformation of the Air and Space Forces to the capabilities needed to provide enduring advantage. An important feature of our budget request is a substantial increase in research and development funding. This investment is a down payment on production and sustainment investments and hard choices that are to come. We're comfortable with the balance struck in this budget submission, but we also want to ensure the committee understands that hard choices do lie ahead at any budget level. In this request, we're asking for divestiture of equipment that is beyond its service life, too expensive to sustain, or not effective against the pacing challenge. These divestitures are necessary to provide the resources required to transform the Department of the Air Force to support integrated deterrence. We appreciate the committee's support for the divestitures we requested last year, and we ask for your support this year and in the future. Change is hard, but losing is unacceptable, and we cannot afford to be too late. The work we have ongoing in the Department of the Air Force to define the necessary transformation is focused on 7 operational imperatives, each of which is associated with some aspect of our ability to project power. As of today, there should be no doubt that great power acts of aggression do occur, and equally no doubt of how devastating they can be for the victims of that aggression. First, if the Space Force is to fulfill its mission of both enabling and protecting the joint force, we must pivot to transformational space architectures and systems. In fiscal year 23, we're asking for funding to begin the transformation to resilient missile warning and tracking and resilient communications networks. Second, we must integrate and efficiently employ air and space forces as part of a highly lethal joint force through an advanced battle management system, or ABMS. This budget continues funding for early increments of ABMS and the ongoing work that will define additional investments that the department needs to cost-effectively modernize our command control, communications, and battle management networks. Third, to defeat aggression, we must have the ability to hold large numbers of air and surface targets at risk in a time-compressed scenario. This budget funds the E-7 Wedgetail as an interim AWACS replacement, while supporting work to define the transformation to a resilient combination of air and space intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance systems. Fourth, our control of the air is being challenged, and we must proceed to an affordable next-generation air dominance family of systems. The budget increases funding for the NGAD family of systems to include a 6th-generation crewed platform and uncrewed, unmanned combat aircraft. Fifth, we must have resilient forward basing for our tactical forces. This budget continues funding for agile combat employment in both the Indo-Pacific and European regions, while we define the most cost-effective mix of hardening, active defense, deception, and dispersion activities. Sixth, we must ensure the long-term viability and cost-effectiveness of our global strike capability. This budget begins the transition of the B-21 from development to production, and it continues the work to define a more extensive global strike family of systems that also includes uncrewed combat aircraft. Finally, the Department of the Air Force must be fully ready to transition to a wartime posture against a peer competitor. In particular, we must strengthen our cybersecurity and our resilience against attacks on the information systems and facilities that we depend upon to go to war. Members of the committee, I look forward to your support as we work to ensure that America's air and space forces are never too late. One team, one fight. We welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Brown.
Good morning, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Rogers and distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor to appear before you and represent the 689,000 total force airmen serving today. Thank you for your continued support to our airmen and their families. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with Secretary Kendall and General Raymond to testify on the FY23 budget submission, a budget that continues to accelerate the Air Force's rate of change to address the national security challenges articulated in the National Defense Strategy, a budget that continues to build on the successes of FY22. The world looks to the United States Air Force as a leading example. Our airmen make air power look easy. It's anything but. A world-class Air Force requires world-class airmen that are organized, trained, and equipped to remain the world's most respected Air Force. But if we do not continue to transform, this may no longer be the case. We must continue to communicate and collaborate with this committee and key stakeholders so we can accelerate change. Last year's budget communicated the Air Force the nation needs for 2030 and beyond. Our message has not changed for fiscal year 23, and it won't change in future budget submissions. We must modernize to counter strategic competitors. The People's Republic of China remains our pacing challenge, and Russia remains an acute threat. So we must balance between the demands of today and the requirements of tomorrow. Failure to do so puts our ability to execute the national defense strategy at risk. It puts soldiers, sailors, Marines, Guardians, Airmen, along with our allies and partners at risk. It puts our ability to place air power anytime, anywhere at risk. The only way our Air Force and nation will be successful balancing risk between today and tomorrow is if we collaborate. In fact, collaboration is the critical word in Accelerate, Change, or Lose. We're beginning to see the success of our collaboration efforts transitioning to the future. This year's budget brought substantial increases to research and development, focused on placing meaningful military capability into the hands of our airmen. Investments in systems and concepts that allow our Air Force to penetrate and dominate in any scenario. Just as important in our investment efforts, we have been successful beginning to divest systems that are increasingly irrelevant against today's and tomorrow's threats. We didn't do this alone. The support of Congress is much appreciated. Accelerating change is the impetus behind the Department of the Air Force's operational imperatives. It means moving with a sense of urgency and doing so in the right direction. This year's National Defense Strategy provides us the needed direction. And when you combine the operational imperatives and the National Defense Strategy, you see this year's budget is in alignment with our nation needs and demands of our Air Force. The Air Force we are building is critical to integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building enduring advantages. Because the nuclear deterrence is the backstop of integrated deterrence, this year's budget ensures our nuclear portfolios are fully funded. Current events are emblematic of how our Air Force is campaigning. We deployed Air Force assets within days, shared vital information, and increased interoperability with our allies and partners. Finally, the Air Force is investing in enduring advantages that allow us to defend the homeland, project our power globally, and operate as a joint, allied, and partner force. More than anyone, I want tomorrow's airmen to be ready to respond when our nation calls. This includes investing in programs that allow all of our airmen and their families to reach their full potential. As the United States Air Force celebrates its 75th anniversary this year, we are committed to remaining the world-class Air Force America can be proud of. Current events demonstrate the world is growing more complex and uncertain. But I am certain we will need air power anytime, anywhere. I'm certain this year's budget is another step towards the transformation of our Air Force. And I am certain there's still work to be done. Therefore, we must continue to communicate and collaborate so we can accelerate change. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Raymond.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor to appear before you today with Secretary Kendall and General Brown, and I'm truly privileged to be part of this leadership team. On behalf of almost 14,000 Guardians stationed around the world, let me begin by thanking you for your continued leadership and strong support of our Guardians and their families. As we testify before you today, we find ourselves at a strategic inflection point where we are faced with an acute threat from Russia and a pacing challenge from China. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has showcased the importance of space to all instruments of power. Information derived from space, including commercial imagery, has been instrumental in dominating the information environment, communicating with forces, detecting missile threats, and sharing of information among allies and partners. It is clear that the character of war has changed, and space is foundational to that change. However, Russia's recent direct-ascent anti-satellite missile test in November is just the latest evidence of efforts to deny our nation the advantages that space provides. Just as concerning, our pacing challenge, China, is integrating space into their military operations to detect, track, target, and strike the joint force, putting our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians on the ground, in the air, and on the sea at high risk. We cannot allow potential adversaries to gain an unchallenged ability to conduct space-enabled attacks. Our joint forces will remain at risk until we can complete the transformation to a resilient architecture and protect the joint force from space-enabled attacks. This is critical to supporting all aspects of the National Defense Strategy, integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building an enduring advantage. To remain the world's leader in space, this President's budget request prioritizes space and invests $24.5 billion to ensure our assured access and freedom to maneuver in the domain. The largest share is research, development, testing, and evaluation funding, almost $16 billion to modernize our forces, a portion of which will begin the pivot to a more resilient and mission-capable missile warning and missile tracking force design. Notably, this includes funding for the Space Development Agency, which is included in the Space Force for the first time this year. In contrast to legacy approaches, this architecture will be built to survive and degrade gracefully under attack, help manage escalation, and be rapidly reconstituted. This transformation will allow us to capitalize more fully on two of our national advantages, our commercial industry and our allies and partners. To increase readiness, we are funding operational test and training infrastructure. This ensures that we can get the right capability on orbit in the hands of operators trained in operating in a contested domain. Robust test and training capabilities are also critical to fielding our next generation of modernized systems. Other key investments include increased funding for weapon system sustainment, a more resilient global positioning system, and next generation satellite communications. And finally, and most importantly, we invest in our guardians and our families. Over the past 2 years, we have overhauled how we recruit, assess, train, develop, promote, employ, and take care of our guardians. Resilient space power isn't just about satellites, it's also about guardians and their families. This is one of the reasons why we are seeking the integration of the active duty and reserve forces into a single hybrid component structure. This space component is central to our human capital plan and will allow us to best align our full-time and part-time members. This is our #1 legislative proposal, and we look forward to working very closely with this committee and Congress writ large to implement this bold and transformational approach. As Secretary Kendall said in his opening comments, change is hard and losing is unacceptable. The transformation we're beginning now is essential to protecting the joint force and the security of space. Thank you again for your leadership and support for our Space Force. It's an honor to appear before you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, when it comes to the Air Force and you're trying to figure out the mix between the F-35, the F-15EX, and then legacy programs, the A-10, F-22, as you're looking, I mean, we're very focused on the competitive fight. How do you survive in an environment going up against what China and Russia can throw at us in terms of the air defenses and the difficulty of surviving in that environment. And then you run into platforms like the A-10, which is incredibly effective in a permissive environment. And maybe we will find a permissive environment or two along the way. Certainly that was the case in Iraq and Afghanistan. When you're looking at those plans, to me, that's one of the most confusing aspects of how do you balance that? You can look at a fight and say, if it's a permissive environment, this is what I want. If it's not, this is what I want. How do you balance that, and how has that informed your plans for what air platforms you want? This applies to tankers and bombers as well. How are you balancing that and figure out what your plan is for the next decade and beyond?
That's a great question. It's an important question. General Brown will have some comments about this also. He's talked about the fighter mix in the past. We do need a mix of capabilities because we're supporting combatant commanders from around the world for a variety of missions, and there's constant demand for air assets everywhere that there are American forces and American interests. Because of that, we maintain a mix which traditionally was kind of a high-low mix, more expensive aircraft that more capable for the more higher requirements, and then a lower cost part of the force that allowed us to give us more quantity and more capabilities overall. That balance traditionally has served us fairly well. What I observe as Secretary is that what we have currently in the pipeline and that will populate our future force tends to be all high-cost, higher-end capabilities. And you look at NGAD, the newest system under development, it's quite expensive. If you look at F-22, it was a fairly expensive aircraft. That's the one that NGAD's replacing. F-35 was intended to be at one time kind of the low end of a high-low mix, but it's an $80 million copy aircraft. It's really expensive. So then the rest of the force is filled out with legacy aircraft we've already acquired to a large extent. So when I look at all of that, and F-15EX is now in the mix too, which has unique reasons why it's in the mix that make good sense, but it's fairly expensive also, partly because of the quantities we're buying, but it's just a more expensive airplane. So basically, we need a more affordable mix for the future, and the question is, how do we get there? And that's one of the reasons I'm introducing the idea of uncrewed combat aircraft that are much less expensive and can be attritable, not necessarily expendable. They're not munitions, but they can be used up at a higher rate and help populate our force structure. Now, that's a ways away. That's quite a few ways out. So in the meantime, we've got to maintain the mix that General Brown has talked about, which is a combination of the F-35, the F-15EX, the F-22, and the F-16. So we're going to be evolving towards a new set of capabilities in the future, but I am very much driven by both affordability requirements and mission requirements as we try to build that capability. I'll let General Brown talk about the mix from an operational perspective.
Yeah, Chairman, we get to this our approach based on analysis, wargaming, and experience, and in a conversation with our combatant commanders as well. As Secretary Kendall described, it is a mix of capability that we need to be able to have. Multi-role capability, because you don't know if you're going to be in a permissive or non-permissive, and I would expect more non-permissive environments in the future. So we got to have that capability. The A-10 is a great platform in a non-permissive environment. I don't see very many non-permissive environments that we're going to roll into here in the future. And this is why we're focused on, the F-35 is a cornerstone of our fleet, and continue to get it upgraded to get to TR-3 and Block 4, so it provides us the capability against a very advancing threat from the PRC. F-15EX, which actually is in the E model, more of a weapons truck. It can carry some high-end weapons. Some of the weapons we are developing, like hypersonic missiles that can fit on a fighter. We'll also have the upgrade the F-22 as it transitions and eventually becomes the NGAD. Will replace the F-22, and then the F-16, which will be our low end. And we still have a number of the post-block or newer block F-16s that we'll keep for a period of time. So that's the mix of capability that we'll have for a fighter. And we do the same thing not only in the aircraft, but it's also got to be the mix of munitions that go with it and the other support aspects of missions that go with that fighter mix.
That's a very important point. And I think I meant a little misleading in my question mentioning China and Russia, but the truth is what's developing when you, as you said, there aren't going to be too many non-permissive environments because you don't have to be a China or Russia these days, as we're witnessing again in Ukraine. A small country, relatively small military, can still have air defense systems that will defeat even the most high-end aircraft. So we're going to have to be prepared to operate in far less permissive environments than we have over the course of the last couple of decades, and that requires a huge mindset shift in terms of what we're going to build. Just a quick question for General Raymond on the satellite architecture. We really had a massive evolution from 20 years ago when we had United Launch Alliances, so we could only afford to have one provider because no one else, there wasn't enough to go around to create competition. Sorry, that didn't make a lot of sense. That you didn't have enough stuff that you were going to buy, so one company was all that could be there, and now it's just proliferating. All manner of different companies are developing both the ability to build satellites and to launch them. So how do you see, once we get through the phase 2 purchases, where do we go in order to make sure we create that competition, but also it's not spread so thin that companies don't see, a possibility of really, making it work economically when they're selling those launch capabilities? How do you balance that in the next couple of decades?
That's a really good question. We are at a really transformation point in space. We go back to 3 tenets on our launch strategy. It's been to have assured access to space, and that gets to your point about not spreading them too thin. We want to make sure that we've got capability, but we've got the right capability to put things in orbit. The second part of our strategy was to promote competition, and so I think there's opportunities here with a manifest that's becoming more significant in numbers, that there's room for increased competition. The third area was to get off the RD-180 engine, and we've bought all the RD-180 engines that we need. In fact, it's less than what Congress allowed us to do, and I'm very comfortable in a good position on that front. I think one of the big changes that we've seen, though, in these smaller constellations that are launched in the past, historically, a rocket would put 1 satellite up or 2 satellites up. What we're seeing now is a rocket putting 80 satellites up, if you will, at a time. And so all that goes into account as we look forward to what a phase 3 would look like.
Yeah. Well, and just put a quick plug in for competition, because I very much believe in that. I think we have a huge opportunity in space that there are so many companies, certainly the big ones that we've heard about, SpaceX, Blue Origin, others, but then, probably a dozen others that are smaller. And if we can encourage that competition, I think we can get a better product for a better price. So I want to make sure we do that. Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Raymond, you and I and General Hyten have talked for years about how overclassified our space systems are. And he's gone now, but you're still there. I know you've been working at trying to get some of this declassified. How's that going?
He's gone, I'm still here, and so is our problem. We're working it. And we have made some progress. We've restructured what I've learned over the years, not only were we overly classified, we were overly classified in kind of a non-normal way. So we've tried to normalize that. We have reduced classification on some programs. For example, our GMTI program from space, which was higher classification, we reduced it so we could work with our partners in industry better. There's a task that came out of the National Defense Authorization Act this past year that was tasked to the Secretary of Defense to do a review of all security classification of all space programs. Assistant Secretary Dr. Plum is working that, and we're integrated with him. There's more work to do, but we've got the right focus on it, and I'm convinced that we're going to make some progress.
Well, it's important. You know, the fact is the American public still doesn't really know what Space Force is about, and it's about satellites, as you know, and it's just incredibly overclassified. We've got to get that information out, not just for the public, but for our adversaries. I think they need to know what we can do in a more open way. And it's for you and General Brown. You know, in FY22, we increased your budget by 6%, and as you know, inflation was at over 8%. How are y'all dealing with that? Give us some examples about what it means to you to have inflation that's greater than the increase in your budget.
Ranking Member Rogers, you know, as we built the budget and not really having a good full understanding where the inflation numbers are going to be, what we'll have to do as we go back into our budget is look at more detail and figure out where the areas that we're going to need to plus up in certain areas or make some choices internal to the Air Force, and then at the same time work inside the department of how we articulate what the impact is from an inflation standpoint on the key areas, because inflation impacts different parts of the force in different ways, and so it'll be some ongoing analysis we'll have to do.
I agree. I'll tell you though, as I said in my opening statement, the department prioritized space in this budget pretty significantly. We have a pretty significant increase to be able to do the critical work that we're doing. It's going to have to be a balance, and we're going to have to work with Congress throughout the year to make sure that we can do it right.
Well, I make that point because, you know, same thing's happening this year. As you have all seen, that SecDef and the chairman testified before this committee acknowledging that the 2.2% that's cooked into this budget proposal is not adequate, and they're going to have to revisit that, which means you're going to have to revisit that as this year progresses, and we try to fashion what the top line is going to be. So I do hope you'll be giving some thought to what you need to make sure that you can meet your requirements to deal with current threats as well as the modernization that we expect from y'all. Secretary Kendall, just a minute ago you were talking about how pricey the F-22 and the F-35 are. The last F-22 we bought cost $131 million. The F-15EX, $90 million per copy. F-35 between $90 and $100 million. What can we do to get those costs down? I mean, this is incredible numbers. You said $80 million a copy for F-35. It'd be nice if it was $80 million. What can we do to get this down?
Ranking members, you know I spend a lot of my time working in the acquisition side of the defense business, and a great deal of that effort was spent on trying to get costs down. We drove the cost of the F-35 down substantially over as it was in development, transitioning into production. We need to continue to do that. Sustainment offers an opportunity for additional cost reductions. And it's important to keep in mind that that's at least half the cost of our weapon systems is in sustainment side. But the key to keeping costs under control starts with requirements. What are you buying? If you put a lot of capability and sophistication into an aircraft, it's going to be more expensive, and that's exactly what we did with the F-35.
So it's been a moving target. Requirements have been.
Requirements have evolved as the threat has changed, but requirements need to be something that you trade off against cost early in a program and then continuously as you go forward. It requires tight cooperation between developers and operators to ensure that we don't just set a rigid set of requirements initially and then spend until we get there. That's not the right way to do it. And I mentioned the operational imperatives earlier. Each of those operational imperatives is led by a combination of an acquisition person or a technical person and an operator. And it's because we have to have that dialogue between those two communities to get to what's reasonable and affordable as part of the mix. It also meets operators' needs, but isn't gold-plated. So I think we're getting, at the end of the day, a very capable aircraft in the F-35. I think we're going to get an aircraft that meets mission needs, the unique mission needs of the F-15EX. I'm watching the Next Generation Air Dominance platform, which I put in motion when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition, very carefully to see if we can keep the cost of that down. As the F-22 replacement, it's going to be a very capable aircraft. It's going to be the one that gives us air superiority in the future. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm introducing a mix of uncrewed capabilities as well, which should be much less expensive than the NGAD platform itself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes, and he is on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we got you loud and clear. Go ahead, Jim.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. And I want to thank our witness for their testimony today. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, let me start with you. You know, we talked this morning about how much we've invested in and we're dependent on our overhead architecture because it advanced technological capabilities. But with that comes real vulnerabilities. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is that the Air Force's Link 16 crypto modernization effort is behind. It's impacting readiness and safety. I'm not happy about this delay. What is the current status of the effort, and when will it be complete? And what are the barriers to a faster timeline, and what can be done to accelerate it?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how much I can say in an open session about it. We have been addressing the crypto mod requirements for Link 16 and became aware of it a few months ago and took steps immediately to put the resources on it that were necessary to get us where we need to be. As we've gone through the last 20 years of being focused on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency campaigns where there wasn't a sophisticated threat to our data links, that's been neglected, quite frankly. So we had to put resources against it. The lead time is basically we're replacing radios, so we have to buy the radios. So there is some lead time associated with that. But it's a problem we're well aware of. That isn't the only concern we have with Link 16. We have some others that go beyond that I don't want to talk about and can't talk about in an open forum. And we really need to get to a next generation of capabilities as well. So that work is getting started also.
And with this, I'm concerned that this has been, the can's been kicked down the road a lot, and I hope that that's the end of that. We're going to actually get this done. Secretary, let me switch to this. It's my hope that in the near future, the department will continue to capitalize on additive manufacturing and be able to, for example, 3D print spare parts for our platforms. This clearly would save time, money, increase readiness, extend the usefulness of platforms for years. So how is the Air Force thinking about things like 3D printing?
There's quite a bit of effort going into that. It's a remarkable technology. I was involved in the establishment of the Additive Manufacturing Innovation Institute under the Obama administration. And in those days, we had a very small number of materials. It's several years ago, plastics initially, but we've moved to a variety of metals now. We've moved to some very complicated and sophisticated geometries. So there's huge potential there. Tinker Air Force Base has done a lot of work piloting on this for maintenance, particularly for building parts for some of our older aircraft, which have been kept so long that things that people thought would never wear out are now wearing out and have to be replaced. So we're using additive manufacturing for that. It has a lot of potential from a whole bunch of different attributes. And so we're continuing that technology, and we're looking for ways to address some of the problems that we have with airworthiness certification, for example, of parts that are built that way. So it's what we're very bullish about and doing quite a bit to take advantage of.
Yeah. Good, because there should be no such thing as obsolete parts anymore. We shouldn't have to cannibalize, say, one aircraft to keep others running if we can harness the power of 3D printing. General Raymond, our military depends on many critical services that were built before we were concerned with things like cyber threats. So the capabilities our satellites provide us with are extremely important. We all know that. And the attack surface for cyber breaches against them is enormous. How is the Air Force preparing for these threats and creating a culture that integrates cyber from the ground up proactively in our future plans and acquisitions? And how would you integrate JADC2 concept into your plans and acquisition?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Space capabilities are basically a computer in space that has a link to a ground, and so it has, as you mentioned in your question, cyber vulnerability. One of the things that we've done when we established the Space Force is to enhance our cyber posture. We brought cyber operators in from the Air Force and from other services to be part of our service. We've built an 06 level command that is focused on cyber. We put detachments at every one of our other operational units. We put cyber operators embedded on the ops floor, sitting side by side with our space operators to better understand the cyber terrain. So although I will never be comfortable that we've got this solved, I'm comfortable that we've got the right focus on it, and we come to work every day making sure that we can protect and defend our space capabilities from a full range of threats, from cyber on the one end to kinetic destruction on the other.
Thank you. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. The chair now recognizes, I believe Mr. Wilson's not here, so I recognize Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning there was a story in the Colorado Springs Gazette regarding a report by the Government Accountability Office on the previous basing decision for U.S. Space Command. I requested this report last year, and this request was granted because of my ranking member position on the Readiness Subcommittee of this committee. And as was reported in this news article, and as I strongly suspected would be the case, the GAO's investigation of the Space Command basing process, quote, identified significant shortfalls in its transparency and credibility, unquote. So I'm deeply concerned that the urgency to achieve full operational capability for our space warfighters as quickly as possible was not adequately addressed in the siting decision because of a flawed process. General Raymond, I know that Space Force posture does not directly impact the basing decision for Space Command. However, I have some questions for you I hope will shed some light on the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing in space. And I know you share my concerns regarding the rapid expansion of these threats. The challenges we face in space have accelerated greatly in the last 2 or 3 years. How significantly do you anticipate the threat will grow in the next 2 to 3 years?
There's a significant threat that exists today, as I mentioned in the last answer to the last question, and it's a spectrum of threats, everything from reversible jamming to kinetic destruction. And all of our intelligence suggests that that's not going to slow down.
Space defense hinges on having accurate and relevant data. Every day, Guardians in my district work side by side with the commander of Space Command on this essential task at the National Space Defense Center. The NSDC is where Department of Defense and intelligence community experts train for and monitor threats to our space infrastructure. Would you agree that maximizing the commander's access to timely information through physical co-location of essential functions is an advantage in maintaining space superiority?
Yeah, we have the ability to command and control from various places. The U.S. Space Command actually has 2 command centers, one in Vandenberg, California, and one in Vandenberg Air Force Base, California, one in Colorado Springs. And so there's ways to do this without being physically co-located. Obviously, being co-located helps that you can go visit more routinely, but you can do it in multiple ways.
Okay. But is reduced decision time, and that comes from working side by side, and the lessening of security threats is something you would prefer as opposed to not having?
I guess I'd ask you, that's a question for General Dickinson from his U.S. Space Command hat as in the operational commander. I'm in the Space Force role. I'd organize, train, equip, and provide him capabilities. That'd be better addressed to him.
Okay. Well, we certainly will. Given the rapidly changing character of space as a warfighting domain, would your military advice generally be to accelerate our ability to defend space by any means that we have at our disposal?
I think it's important that the nation is prepared to conduct operations in space and to protect and defend those for the good of our nation, for the good of our joint and coalition forces, and for the good of the world.
To me, reaching full operational capacity for Space Command as quickly as possible should be our highest priority as a country. The threats are too serious, and the threats are not going to wait. We have no other choice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. The temporary chair now recognizes himself for a few questions. Secretary Kendall, one program that does seem like it's not too late is the B21 program, which, again, we can't get into much details here, but I did want to ask you about a question that you and I discussed a couple weeks ago, which is that on the sustainment side, the contract that was used for the B21, which you were involved with from your prior service in Washington, took a different approach in terms of how the software ownership and proprietary rights were going to be set up. And maybe you could just talk about that in terms of the impact that it's going to have, hopefully a positive impact in terms of the sustainment costs for that program in the future.
Sure. There are 2 points I'd make in that regard. One is that with the digitized world that we lived in, designs now are all entirely digital. And I've given guidance to our acquisition people that we should be taking delivery of our designs going forward for all of our programs. There was an era in which there was a philosophy about letting the prime contractor basically take life-to-death responsibility for a program. That was not effective. It basically put people in a sole source position forever. It didn't work out well for the government. B21, which Dr. LaPlante, who's now the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, who was then the Air Force Acquisition Executive, and I, when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, we put in place a plan to transition software maintenance to the government. The Air Force has had some very good experience with doing this with some other programs, and it's a job that allows the government to maintain control of the technical baseline, if you will, to own the product fully as it goes forward, and to take control of how it matures from a software perspective. So we've had good experience with that, and that's the approach I think we're taking on the B21.
Yeah, it may seem like a pretty sort of arcane point, but we've had numerous hearings with GAOs weighing in terms of how the software was handled for F-35, and it really has been, I think, a big, according to the GAO, factor in terms of driving up the cost of sustainment. So again, it's one of those programs which it's part of the recapitalization of the triad, as well as having a conventional mission. So time is of the essence, and it looks like, again, it's not going to be too late. So hopefully we'll all keep working together in terms of making sure of that. Mr. Lamborn talked about the decision in terms of the Space Force headquarters. There was another decision that was made in the last year or so regarding the C-130J basing decisions, which as some of us recall, actually a decision was made before, which preceded appropriation for that facility, and that certainly left some of us a bad taste in our mouth in terms of just how that was managed. We're now back in, there was no GAO report, but I think that, honestly the facts sort of speak for themselves. We're now back in a new round of C-130J basing, and I would simply ask you and maybe General Brown just to assure us that there will be full open communication and transparency during this upcoming selection process, because again, I think that is critical to, I think, the confidence of this committee and the Congress in general.
I want to assure you that our strategic basing process, or whatever process we use to make basing decisions, sometimes we do it through the budget process basically, will be clear, open, transparent, and apolitical. If there's one thing I've learned in my experience in this position so far, it's the extreme concern that people like yourself have for basing decisions. And I want to be able to present all of our basing decisions in a way which you can fully understand them and understand what the basis was for them. You may not agree with it, but you'll understand that it was set up to be in the interest of the nation and in the best interest of the Department of the Air Force, and that was what was behind any decision that we made.
Great, I appreciate that. General, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Well, it ends up being a secretary's decision, but what I focus on is ensuring that when we look at from a mission perspective, we're able to one, do the mission, but at the same time, the support for the mission, but also to our airmen and families that come into those communities as well. But we'll be very open and transparent with you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Secretary Kendall, I want to begin with you. Last year you said, if it doesn't threaten China, why are we doing it? I couldn't agree more. We had that conversation the other day. You also said, in your words, that you're focused on the shortest path possible to a better generation of actual fielded capability. Last year, General Brown, you acknowledged, again in your words, by saying China continues to move its modernization timelines left at a rate of change that is outpacing the United States. This year's budget submission from the Air Force over the next 5 years retires 646 aircraft and builds 246 aircraft. That's a deficit of 400 aircraft. And I understand NGAD and modernization and all the things that we want our aircraft to do, unmanned platforms. But 400 is one heck of a big vulnerability, capacity, and capability gap that, in light of your words about the things that scare China or the things that we need to move our efforts to the left because we're being outpaced by China, just doesn't seem to add up. Can you give me your perspective on what operational risk you think that we will be facing in the next 5 years as we spin down 646 aircraft and build back 246?
Appreciate the question. There is operational risk, and this is something that when I talk about balancing risk over time, there's a balance between the operational risk we will see today as we make that transition versus the risk we will have in the future if we don't start to modernize. And this is a conversation that you have internally with the Air Force. It's a conversation I have with our combatant commanders and naturally with this committee and others. We do have to make some tough choices. I also look at not just the numbers, but I look at the overall capability and capacity, not just the airplanes, but what goes with the airplanes, as I mentioned earlier, whether it be the weapons, our trained airmen, the support systems that go with. And so it's a complete package. But I agree, there is some risk there. But I'd rather take a little bit of risk now than a lot of risk later in a future conflict.
Gotcha. Let me ask this to both Secretary Kendall and General Brown. What investments do you support that would accelerate these modernization timelines, that would, however you term it, buy back some of that risk or reduce that risk over time?
I was thinking as you spoke earlier, Congressman, about China and their relative performance compared to ours. I've looked at the data on this. Their engineers are not faster than our engineers. Their lead time to field any given capability is comparable to our own. But what they have done that we have not probably done enough of is start a lot of new things and then take them through to fielding. When I look at the scale and the breadth of what they're doing to modernize, they seem to be very open to integrating new technologies and integrating them and using them in creative ways. We've got to be more forthcoming about that sort of thing. So that requires some cultural changes, if you will. Acceptance of uncrewed combat aircraft, for example. We have to actually do what we talk about in programs like JADC² and ABMS and get to real capability. When I look at what we've done, particularly over the last few years, we've done programs that were designed to go fast, but they weren't necessarily going in the right direction, and they didn't necessarily get to the place you want to get to. It's the hare and the tortoise problem. Going quickly to do a demonstration doesn't get you very far down the road to a real fielded production-ready capability. So I've asked our acquisition people to look at all those programs and make sure they're structured to, and my guidance is to get meaningful military capability, not just one or two or something, but meaningful military capability as quickly as possible. At the end of the day, that's going to be about resources. Production is much more expensive than R&D, and sustainment is comparable to production. So at the end of the day, we're going to need the support of this committee and others to move some of those programs forward and get them into production. We will accept some risk. We can accept quite a bit of risk in early experimental phases where failure is acceptable, and we want to try things. But once we commit to a real product, we want to manage that risk so that we do get the product. And it includes trades-off between requirements sometimes and cost and other things and risk. It requires prudent investment to draw down risk, to drive it down as efficiently and quickly as possible. And General Brown was talking about risk over time. I'm very aware of the increasing threats that we're going to be facing, looking out at what their programs are and what they're going to be fielding. And as much as we might have concerns today, they're going to be much worse in the future if we don't make the right investments.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and gentlemen. Thank you for your service, and thank you for appearing here today. General Raymond, Among the support groups you have available to you are National Guard units. There's been a discussion about how those National Guard units might be integrated into the Space Force. Would you please discuss how this might be done, or if you intend to do it?
Yes, sir. We've operated, first of all, let me just say, we've operated with the Air, when we were in the Air Force, part of the Air Force, we operated with the Air National Guard for 25 years. There's 8 states that have Guard capabilities, space capabilities, and 1 territory in Guam. That represents 836 or so Guardian or professionals that do the space mission. When the law was passed to establish the Space Force, Congress directed that we do a study on how best to integrate. If you have a service that has 14,000 people, there might be a way to do this more effectively. We did that study, and as a result of that study, we came up with the 1 component with the reserve and active being put together. And then on the Guard, there's several ways you can do it. And so you could keep the Guard in the Air National Guard and have the Air National Guard continue to provide support. You could, option 2 is you could take the Space National, the men and women out of the Air National Guard and stand up as a separate Space National Guard. Or you can take those capabilities out of the Guard totally and put them in this 1 component. So there's multiple ways. The law, this NDA directed us to do some more study on the best way to do that.
Then you are fully aware that at least the California Air National Guard would like to have the space unit of that National Guard unit become a space directly into the Space Force.
Yes, sir. I'm aware they provide great capability. As I mentioned, the 8 different states have this capability, and they provide us great.
My understanding is they're not the only National Guard unit around the nation.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. We're aware of this. We're going to follow it, obviously. General Brown, not my favorite subject, but one that you and I have spent some time on. The GBSD, you're not hiding the ball by changing the name, are you?
Not at all.
I didn't think so, but I want to be clear about it. Presently, the Minuteman III is expected to continue to perform until the late 2030s. Is that correct?
We will have aspects of the Minuteman III that will continue to perform because as we bring on Sentinel or GBSD, we've got to make sure we still have the nuclear capability is part of our integrated deterrence. So it's a transition. It's not a flip of a switch to get from one to the other. So we're going to have to continue to maintain Minuteman III capability to make that transition.
So the answer is the Minuteman III can be and will be maintained until the late 30s.
Aspects of the Minuteman III will be maintained to the 30s. You will not have the full capability required to support what we have as a requirement right now.
Well, that gets into a lot of detail, some of which is classified, and we will continue to pursue it. Have you figured out what it will cost on the military construction side to replace the Minuteman III systems?
We've done the analysis on that. I don't have the number out, exact number for you, but I can get that for the record.
There is no number, is there?
No, there is.
You really don't know what it's going to cost on the military construction side to replace all of the facilities necessary for the Sentinel/GBSD.
There is a number, and I know we've been working with your staff, and I'll get back with you to give you more detailing and also more for the record.
It's presently not in the budget that's been presented to us. Is that correct?
I'd have to double check on that.
Okay. 50 seconds. The chairman raised an exceedingly important point in his opening comments, and that is the world seems to have changed rapidly in the last 3 months. And the most sophisticated airplanes and facilities of the Russian military seem to be incapable of overcoming some rather less sophisticated systems. I want to have a full discussion this year about what the chairman raised about maybe big, very expensive, very sophisticated systems may not be the future. We don't have time to go into it, but that issue needs to be fully discussed as we complete this NDAA. Thank you. I yield back.